Good morning. My name is Corey Kimball, and I am the General Manager of the Slalom office here in Portland. Our third annual Realize event is centered on bringing leaders in our community together to learn and connect. We are in unprecedented times today with the global pandemic, the highest unemployment rate since the Great Depression, deaths and demonstration of racism and civil unrest, and a general fear about what the next weeks and months may bring. It is amidst this environment that we are coming together to reimagine what our future may look like. We welcome you to learn, connect, engage, and reflect, hopefully taking a few things with you that you may apply to your organization or even your personal lives. This morning's topic is replanning during disruption, and our presenter today is Alexandra Reese. Alexandra is a consultant at Slalom with over a decade of experience helping companies and government agencies design and execute innovative strategic plans. As an economist with a passion for leader and team development, Alexandra specializes in creating strategies that are grounded in data and have the support for implementation. Alexandra, thank you for joining us, and please take it away.
All right, thank you, Corey, and thank you to each of you for being here today. I'd like to pause before I begin the presentation in earnest, really to recognize the moment we're in. It felt authentic to just take that pause. George Floyd's death at the hands of police was one of the more tragic examples of racism and inequality that our country and local community have yet to address. And finally, when the nation's attention is focused on this issue, I really had to pause before coming here today. I've been hesitant to divert attention from those voices that must be heard. The voices of people of color, those in our community who have historically been barred from positions of leadership. I'm really in a place in my own life where I'd like to listen. And so it's in that context that I found myself this week asking the question, how can I use this time with you today to support the important conversations that must be had and not detract from them?
No, hey, so it's just starting. What do you need?
Planning for disruption is, at its core, about equipping our teams to have challenging and often uncomfortable conversations about what the future might hold and how we could respond. And although the process I'm going to walk through today may on its surface look different than the DEI processes our organizations are working through, I believe both share many common cultural ingredients to success. Making a safe space for people to give voice to their fears, creating space for those outside leadership to have a voice, inviting disagreement, challenging the status quo. So in that spirit, I hope you'll gain some insights today that can help your organizations navigate the full range of disruptions we're all working through. And I'd like to invite you to share your own experiences or insights as they pertain to DEI, the moment we're in, or this conversation around planning for disruption in the chat as we move through. Laura, another fellow consultant at Slalom, is going to be moderating the chat, so please do use it. We would love to hear from you as we go through. And Cassie, who's also on the line, will be helping with some polling questions so that this feels more interactive. So with that, thank you. And I'm excited to spend the next 40 to 45 minutes together. And our focus today is really on three facets of planning for disruption. One, why you should spend time planning. Two, how to plan effectively. And three, activities and tips that you can leverage today. And I thought it would be interesting and helpful to share a story that really felt like a parallel of the moment we're in as I think about coronavirus and the disruption it's really caused our communities, both in and outside of business. I took this photo in October 2013 during a trek in Corsica. It was right in the middle of a 10-day journey, and this photo is taken in the middle of a beautiful mountain range. Unexpectedly, that cloud that was coming in that captured my attention actually turned out to be the start of a giant storm front. And unexpectedly, we found our entire trek derailed by this storm. I remember as that cloud came over us, I put my hand out in front of me and I couldn't even see the tips of my fingers. It literally wasn't safe to keep moving. So we had to shelter in place. And over the next 22 hours in our tiny backpacking tent nestled in that mountain you see ahead of you, we planned and we watched and we waited to see what would happen. And over the course of that time, we had to assess our current state. We had to consider what might be different scenarios for how the weather could unfold. And then we had to determine, given different pathways for that future, how might we proceed? And we had to really create a few different plans. And I wanted to share this story because it struck me as a remarkable parallel to the moment we're in today. We are all in an unexpected storm, and there's a lot of uncertainty. Uncertainty is scary. It breeds fear, anxiety, stress. It's painful, and it can make life quite literally miserable. And while we can't predict the future, resolve our uncertainty and fear, we can learn how to navigate periods of uncertainty and disruption better. And that's what we're here to talk about today. And a few questions that you might be asking could be things like, how will the economy reopen? Will we still be able to get what we need from our usual suppliers and at prices we can afford? How have consumer constituent needs changed? And what does that mean for my organization? How do we play catch up on our digital transformation, especially when resources are tight? And when will this happen again, and how do we prepare? And my hope is that the 5-step process I'll share with you today can become a framework for navigating these and all the many other questions that you and your organization are likely struggling with right now. And before I dive into this process, I would love to take a moment to hear from you. So please go into the chat function and put in a phrase or a few words that represent your top concern as you consider planning and preparing for the next normal, or in general for periods of disruption. I love that. My teenager's future, safety, community connection, equity, stability. I love the range of feedback I'm seeing. It seems to span both our personal lives and a lot of the challenges we're trying to navigate there, as well as our organizational future. And with respect to that second facet, how are we both managing our business, but also supporting our people to not only survive, but thrive? The steps in the process I'm going to share and some of the details certainly veer more toward how do we navigate an uncertain business climate, but I use these same steps in my day-to-day personal life as I'm planning what decisions might I take? What are my different pathways forward? So I would encourage you as we go through to think of these steps as not only something you can apply in your business context, but also something you might be able to apply in your personal life. And with respect to how it can support teams, please continue to use the chat to ask questions. I'll try and touch on how this process can support team engagement and development as we go. I love to hear that that's on the minds of so many of you. So as I mentioned, what I'd like to share with you today is really a straightforward 5-step process that you can use to plan for disruption. And the rest of the presentation is going to be focused on walking through each of them in a little bit more detail. I'll provide an example and I'll provide some tips and tricks that you can use along the way. Step 1 is really preparing to plan. We can't just dive in. We have to make sure we have the right team together and that they're prepared for the trek that we're about to begin. We need to assess our current state. We have to understand what is our point of departure? And it may be the case that there are a lot of unknowns, but let's figure out what those unknowns are before we dive into talking about the future. We then want to build scenarios. So once we understand where we are today, it's important that we understand what's the weather that we might encounter as we navigate our future, because that's going to impact not only how we get there, but it might even impact where do we decide to go. And then we want to align on the strategic direction forward. So given the current state, given the weather we might encounter along our trek, what are the different pathways our organization could take in terms of outcomes and in terms of initiatives to get us there? And then we'll want to create a workable plan. So understanding what's the map with the routes and the signposts clearly marked that we're going to use to help guide our journey. And many of you here today have done some form of strategic planning, likely a robust organizational plan. So many of these steps likely sound really familiar to you. So I'm going to focus my time with you today on sharing some points of view on how this planning process might look different from a typical planning process. And then I'll also share some unique tips and tricks along the way that might help you to navigate the particular moment in time we're in or this specific planning process. And again, given the breadth of experience that people have in the room, I do invite you to use the chat to share any of your own personal experiences or unique insights. I'm here sharing my own, but it would be great to hear if any of you have advice that you think would also be helpful for others to hear. So preparing to plan. Just like a typical planning process, you have to prepare effectively. You need a planning team. That planning team needs to be guided by a clear process, and they need to be empowered by the appropriate resources. I'd recommend for this type of planning process to keep your team on the smaller side, say 3 to 5 individuals, and I would consider a facilitator who can be that neutral third party. I would consider a planning process that encompasses both engagement as well as data and insights. And something that I found really helpful as I work with organizations is to be very clear on how we're going to make decisions up front before we get into what can feel like a more high-pressured situation when we're close to the decision point later on in the process. And when it comes to resources, a few considerations are bandwidth, collaboration tools, and research and data. And given, I think, the moment we're in, I wanted to highlight how you can also consider diversity, equity, and inclusion, and use this lens to really ensure that you have a more robust outcome and a more robust process. When you think about team composition, one thing to consider is not just having your leadership team be your planning team, but also bring in voices who don't typically sit at the leadership table, but have unique insights on what's happening in your operating environment or within your organization. Over the course of my career, when I've done planning processes, I've always been surprised and pleased by the unique insights that those different voices from across the organization can bring to the table. So bring 1 or 2 of them into the planning room to help bring that different point of view. Related to that, as you work through the process, think about how do I engage diverse voices from across the organization? We want to hear from different levels of staff. We want to make sure we have a good balance of different perspectives. And also make sure you're bringing in data and research that can challenge the inside point of view. So objective views on the marketplace, objective data on key trends, those are all important ingredients to success. And we actually have a webinar tomorrow at, I believe, 4 p.m. that's going to talk a little bit more about that topic. So once you have your team together, the next step is really to assess the current state. And I'm sure most, if not all of you, have done a current state assessment. What I would suggest look different about this particular assessment is that you really focus not on the universe of things happening in our environment, but really on what's changed. So focus on evaluating your business model and strategy through the lens of what must be true for these to still be relevant. So you'll want to ID assumptions. And I'd recommend using a framework to categorize your assumptions so that you don't end up missing any important facets of your business model or your strategy. And you may not have something under each of these categories, and that's okay. But I would recommend you go through and ask the question, are there any assumptions that we've made that inform the development of our current strategy that we need to consider? And then you want to check the validity of those assumptions. So which are true, which do we know are no longer true, and where do we have uncertainty? And that last one is really important, and I'll come back to that in the example and in the next step. When possible, you'll want to recast known assumptions. So if there are things like, if you're a public agency budget, for example, or if you're a private organization, it might be supply chain impacts. So if there are things in your assumptions list that you know we have new updated information on, grab it and get it in there. And finally, you'll want to identify additional areas of uncertainty. So it may be the case that there are new significant changes or unknowns that we need to consider that weren't part of your prior planning process, and now's the time to capture those. And at its core, this step in the process is really about pressure testing our strategy and our business model to understand what are the core areas of uncertainty and what are the key risks that we face to success, because that will allow you to understand how might we need to pivot going forward. So I'm going to take you through an example, and I'll kind of work through the same example over the course of the remainder of the presentation. And I'm going to walk you through the example of a hypothetical school district. I selected this because as I looked at the attendees who had registered, I saw we had a great diversity of organizations, from people in consumer products and B2C to people all the way over in utilities and the public sector. And I wanted to pick an example that would be understandable and hopefully resonate across the board. So I'm going to use a hypothetical school district. We're calling it Neverland School District, or NSD for short. So I'm going to imagine we're in the shoes of that organization trying to plan for disruption in this very moment. And if I were this school district, the first step, of course, is to look at our strategic plan. So maybe it's 2019 to 2021. And just for the sake of simplicity, let's imagine we have kind of 4 key OKRs. 2 might be around outcomes we're hoping to drive. So let's imagine a 7% increase in the student population that they need to accommodate. And the second, perhaps, is an increase in the graduation rate by 5%. I'll also include 2 strategies that are more around the how we accomplish those outcomes. So the first may be investment in education model innovation, specifically around early childhood learning and career and technical education. And the second might be to build 1 new high school, which is a huge undertaking, as you can imagine. So if we're NSD, the next step is to look at those 4 strategies and say, what must be true for these strategies to still be relevant? So we pull out our framework, and I'd recommend starting with the external, because those are things that are less in our control than things like our business model. So start there. And you'll see we have some assumptions around enrollment, what our competitors are doing, what's happening in the regulatory environment around our budget. And then you can look at what are the assumptions that have to be true on the internal side? Things like the ratio of on to off campus is important. Things like how many instructional staff we have and corporate sponsors for CTE. Those might be a few assumptions. And of course, if you're doing this with your team and your organization, you're likely going to end up with a longer list. As you make it though, I would focus on a few things. One, focus on the most important assumptions. Start with outcomes and then ask what must be true to achieve those. Second, time horizon matters. So it may be the case that some of your assumptions, like if you're a B2C organization, you might have a lot of assumptions around your digital transformation strategy. Many of the initiatives may be the same, but the time horizon now may be uncertain, and it's important to capture that. And then leverage past data. So dig out the situation assessment and prior planning documentation to help. Now, again, if we're NSD, the next step is to really identify what's true, not true, and uncertain, and then additional areas of uncertainty. So bring forward the list and then pull out a highlighter and just start going through and marking it up. And the focus here is really to break apart this list. So now we have a much more tangible number of areas of uncertainty or new assumptions that we need to focus on. And this becomes the short list of things that we want to explore when we talk about scenarios. Laura, I see that we have a number of people posting in the chat. Are there any questions that would be helpful to address at this stage?
No, this is great content so far. I think the one question might just be reiterating, this is how we're prioritizing how we then set up our scenarios for future planning around the yellow and the red sections. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's an opportunity, you know, as we're trying to think about the future, it can be, at least for myself, really easy to get overwhelmed by the number of areas of uncertainty in our environment, whether that be personal, just for me in my own life, or in the business. And so this is a way to start wrestling that down to a meaningful set of things that we can start to explore. So great question. I hope that helps provide some additional clarification. So that next step is to build scenarios. So we understand our point of departure. Now we want to understand what's the weather we might encounter along the way. And scenarios and successful scenario planning at its core is really about understanding what are different, very divergent points of view about how our operating environment might shift, so that we can look at that and then plan for those different futures. And there are a couple steps that you'll want to take to build scenarios. First is really identifying those top drivers of change. So you have a list of areas of uncertainty from your previous step. You're then going to want to ask, what are the 2 to 4 most impactful assumptions, or those that have the most uncertainty facing our organization, and how do we leverage those? You'll then want to build diverse scenarios of future conditions. So given different combinations of those drivers, what are the implications for radically different points of view? And I'd love to pause and just get a sense with a poll of people's experience or comfort level with scenarios. So Cassie, do you mind launching that? Great, okay, so I see about half of the people have voted. If you haven't, please click or select an option. Right, I see a good balance of people between they've heard of it but haven't used it. They consider scenarios when they refresh their strategy, and I see several people use them regularly, which is great to hear. Right, so I'm going to end poll so you can see the results there. So I'm going to go through a scenario example. I'll provide a little bit of insight onto what makes a good scenario, what are some things to watch out for as you move through the process. For those of you in those categories who you use scenarios when you refresh your plan, or you use them on a regular basis to manage the organization, please do share any feedback or insights that you have in your chat. And for those of you for whom scenario planning is newer or you have less familiarity, please don't hesitate to ask questions. I'm also available, and I'll share my contact information at the end of this webinar, so you can reach out with questions later. So as we look at scenarios for NSD, the first step again is to identify our top drivers. So in this case, we're going to look at 2 drivers. One is return to the classroom, and 2 is budget. And it could be the case, I've done a lot of scenario planning with organizations that you consider a larger number of drivers and get more complex with the creation of scenarios. There are a lot of different ways that you can form them. This is one way to keep it relatively simple so that you're focusing on a smaller number of things. And that can be helpful when you're planning on a much more compressed timeline as we are right now. And then you'll want to identify what are the extreme ends of each driver. So for driver one end may be, we're gonna plan for a return in September of 2020. And the other end might be wanting to explore what would happen if we never return to a traditional in-class learning environment as our dominant mode of education model delivery. The second driver might be budget. And at one end, we might want to explore what's possible if we're able to attain our current projected level of funding. And at the other end, we may want to explore what would happen if we had to deal with a 25% reduction. For the drivers, focus on those that are the most significant or can be somewhat representative of other potential changes in your organization. I actually did scenario planning with a school district several years ago. And for example, we used funding as one driver. And we never explored what would happen in the case of a pandemic. But through the funding lens, we did explore what would be possibilities for transitioning to distance learning, reducing the expectations on instructional hours or staff. What would happen if we had to do less in-class learning? And so there were a lot of initiatives that we explored that enabled them to really pivot much more quickly than some other organizations in today's environment. So you don't have to have your drivers perfectly representative back to the future, as long as they allow you to explore very divergent pathways. When you look at those ends of the spectrum, it's important that you're considering things that are plausible, but not necessarily probable. So we want to really explore the extremes, because if we for the extremes, we're likely to satisfy the middle. And once you have that done, you'll want to create your scenario points of view. So I'd recommend each quadrant get its own scenario. You'll see here we have 4 that result from this exercise. And it's important to give them catchy names and succinct and memorable stories, because for scenarios to be used, they have to be part of the lore and story of your organization. So things like those catchy titles, stories, photos that make them more tangible can help make sure they're used regularly. And for each scenario, you'll want to craft a bit of a story. So for example, if we take that scenario 4, Brave New World, we want to understand kind of what's the short description of what's happening in that external environment. So in this case, digital and distance learning, that's the new normal. And NSD has to serve its students with 75% of its current budget. You'll then want to come up with key characteristics. So characteristics might include return to classroom, budget, the learning environment. And you'll want to make sure your key characteristics are consistent across scenarios so that you can compare and contrast. And at the end of this step, you should have a clear picture from step 2 of what's our current state or our departure point. Step 3, what are different future scenarios for what the world might look like. And as we navigate our future, what are the biggest areas of uncertainty? And once you have these steps done, you're ready to start charting your strategic direction or your path from today to tomorrow. So when you think about aligning on the strategic direction, first and foremost, it's about answering the question, how would we change the fundamentals of our business, our customers, what we offer them, our growth targets, and our operating model in response to the different scenarios? And that order is intentional. I'd recommend starting with customers because you always want to be customer-centric and try and follow the needs of your customers and align to them as close as possible. They should be the leader in determining how you pivot your business. And your operating model comes last because what you do there is really about enabling you to serve your customers and deliver them the products and services they need or want. And of course, there's some iteration, but I think that general flow is helpful to keep in mind. And given the experience that many of you have with strategy and planning, I didn't think it would be a good use of our time to dive into the details of how to work through specific strategic initiatives. If you have a process within your organization that works well, use that. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. If you don't, or you'd like to refresh this facet of your planning process, please feel free to ask a question in the chat box or reach out to me after the webinar. I'd be happy to share resources or bat around ideas about how you can work through your own organization's strategic direction, both from an ideation standpoint to a testing and validation standpoint to an alignment and implementation. I do tend to get a lot of questions from organizations about how to generate novel and innovative ideas. So I want to spend just a couple minutes talking about one idea for doing that you could implement even today at the end of this webinar. And I'll also let you know that we have a webinar later today at 4 p.m. With a couple of my colleagues who will be really diving into detail on innovation. So if this topic interests you, please do tune back in then. The framework that I love, a simple one for coming up with new and innovative ideas around your strategic direction, is propelling questions. It's not something I invented, but it's something I use often. And it's really about asking those questions that will propel innovation and out-of-the-box thinking. And it begins with asking the right question. And that question is pairing a bold ambition with a significant constraint. So instead of trying to solve for those biggest constraints, for example, a 25% reduction in budget, we're using them to say, we can't change this constraint, so how do we use it to leapfrog and take the next big leap forward? So in the case of NSD, they might ask a question, how do we attain 100% graduation rate when we have a 25% reduction in budget? So we're not going to try and solve for the budget. We're going to try and get creative about how we accomplish our outcome. And then you'll want to explore potential answers to that question. And these activities are really an opportunity for divergent thinking and exploration. So give your team the permission to be creative, a little wild, and throw things at the wall. So when you explore opportunities, it's about crafting a we can if answer to that question. So we can achieve our bold ambition of 100% graduation rate if we, and this is a framework for starting to just prompt thinking about different creative solutions. So in the case of NSD, some answers might include, Substitute classroom learning with independent study or apprenticeships. Resource technology with corporate or foundation sponsors. Or maybe they remove district boundaries and create one larger district across the state so they can minimize the share of fixed costs like administration. And a way that you can make this more inclusive in your organization is to create focus groups or sessions with cross-functional teams from across the org and really invite them to participate in creating new and innovative solutions. Not only will that engage people in the process and excite them and make them feel ownership about the future direction, but you're likely to surface a lot of really new and interesting ideas. So this is a great opportunity to start building that muscle of getting comfortable with uncertainty, getting comfortable talking about what scares us, and getting comfortable challenging ourselves to think about new and innovative ideas. And once you have that long list of can-if statements, your team will need to do some work to cull that down to a meaningful list of key initiatives that you might pursue under each scenario. And the idea is really to understand if the future tracks toward a given direction, you want to have alignment around what are potential solution sets so that when you start to track that way, you're not starting from square one. You're able to really pivot and be agile quickly. So you'll see under Brave New Worlds, we have our scenario point of view that we pictured, and then we'll want to build on that at the end of this step with our path forward. So that might be things like introduce self-directed education models, provide parent training so they can be advocates and resources for their children. You might try and secure 2 additional corporate sponsors so that you can offer even more CTE training and education. You might also explore redistricting so you can rebalance your population, and you might explore leasing options for district buildings. What you'll find as you go through this activity of populating scenarios with those key initiatives for the path forward is that there are actually a lot of initiatives that might be possible or beneficial under different scenarios. And what that tells you is that those are relatively low risk initiatives that you could pursue today with relatively high certainty that they're going to yield positive outcomes. So hold on to those and think about how do we enact those soon. What you'll also uncover is there are a few strategic risks that you might want to invest in because they're likely to unlock growth or unlock your bold ambition under just 1 or 2 scenarios. And it's important that you have that balanced risk portfolio. So that's how to think about some of those initiatives and how to start integrating them into your plan. And that's what that final step is about, is really creating a workable plan. So you want to, as I just spoke about, evaluate and solidify your initiatives. And again, include safe bets and include strategic risks. And build in signposts, so establish metrics that will help you to track drivers of change and measures that indicate critical gates. So if you're a school district, perhaps it's in Q2 of your fiscal year, you're going to watch for what's our final budget target. And given how that budget target lands, you might have one set of initiatives that you'll pursue and another. And you need to know what's that critical gate and how will we proceed. And that's really about aligning on the future decision gates and initiatives. And finally, it's important to align on governance practices. So you need to know who will govern the plan and how they'll work together to do so. This process is most effective when it is part of a larger organizational effort to be more agile. And to be successful and be agile and respond to disruption, it has to be part of a longer term muscle that you build. And so in that sense, I'd recommend that you think about merging this effort with your existing strategy effort if you have it. most organizations, if not all, have a list of things that they're working on that exceeds their resources. So we don't want to tax people even more with another thing to do. So if you already have a strategy that you're working, it's important that you integrate the processes together. So align on governance practices. Leverage or update your current plan management framework. And again, align on decision rights and how you engage with leadership. Evaluate and solidify your current initiatives. So if you already have a set of initiatives on your current plan, you need to reconcile that with the initiatives that you've identified under this replanning exercise. And as part of that, be sure that you're engaging those who developed the last plan to build buy-in. What you don't want is to have people feel like the work that they had done previously is no longer valuable. Again, you'll want to make sure you're tracking the right signposts. So leverage and update your current dashboard. And I'd encourage you, so again, that you're not overtaxing people, that you're focusing on the biggest areas of uncertainty or the highest impact drivers, even if some things need to fall off your dashboard. And finally, make sure that you're aligned on future decision gates and initiatives. So know who's responsible for deciding in Q2 when we get our budget target, which direction we're going, and how will they make that decision. So with that, I thought I would share my contact information in case you would like to reach out. Again, I'm happy to share additional resources on any of the topics I've covered here today. Set up a conversation to talk about what questions you might have or how you can implement this in the organization, or just have a general conversation. I'd love to hear your insights and what you're doing. It's always a great opportunity to learn. So thank you so much for joining in today. If you'd like to attend future sessions, we have several more sessions coming up later today through the end of the week. As I mentioned during the webinar, there are two that I think are really closely tied to what I've shared with you today. That's Harnessing Opportunities for Innovation, which is today at 4, and a webinar on Empowering Your Post-COVID Strategy with Data tomorrow at 4. And I'm happy to stay on the line for Q&A for a few more minutes. I know we're right at time, so if people have to go, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and engagement today.
Alexandra, there was a question about the drivers of your scenario matrix. Two questions. One, because it's such a critical component of all the later steps, can you restate how you get to the 2 drivers from the previous step? And is it only 2 because it ultimately is creating a quadrant?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I've done this before, it's more an art than a science. Typically, we start with a list of drivers on a whiteboard. In today's world, it might be a Miro board. And you'd start to just pick, what do we think are the kind of leading drivers of change? So what are the independent drivers versus what are the dependent drivers? And similar to the example I gave with Beaverton School District, you know, we had to play, is funding the right one, or is planning for some type of health disruption the right one? So we tested both and saw what would be outcomes of scenarios. So it's about kind of winnowing down to the ones that are the leading drivers of change, putting them on that grid and just playing around and seeing, are these scenarios that are going to allow us to have very divergent views of the future? You don't necessarily have to stick with 2. Another methodology for creating scenarios that I've used is we did 4 drivers of change. And what we did was we said, if we kind of hold 3 drivers constant based on an expected outcome, and we shift 1 driver to an extreme, how does that impact the organization? So we essentially ended up with 4 scenarios. So in the case of the school district, we looked at funding, technology, attendance, and education model innovation. So we said, what if we kind of expect business as usual for the first 3, and we just radically shift funding? How does that impact the future? So that's another way to craft them. And I'm happy to share resources on scenario methodologies after if that's helpful for people.
Great, thank you.
Other questions that people have?
I think we've covered it. We've got a lot of great thank yous and fantastics. So, and I think our audience is slowing down a little bit. So I think with that, it's probably a good time to just say thank you again, and great job, Alexandra.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining. It was great to spend this time with you today. I look forward to future conversations about this topic. Take care.